The salt spray, a constant kiss on my weathered face, offered no comfort. It was the same sting, the same biting chill that had accompanied me to so many dead ends. Now it was just another reminder. I stood on the jagged lip of the coastal cave, tide coming in, the roar of the ocean a deafening echo against the hollow chambers within. My breath hitched, a ragged sound lost in the wind's howl. This place. It was too familiar. But the report, clutched tight in my fist, had pulled me back from the brink, back into the suffocating embrace of the past. The words blurred, then sharpened. Unusual entry points, precision tools, no witnesses, a signature, eerily reminiscent. Reminiscent, that was the word that had snagged my attention, a hook in the gut. Reminiscent of him, of the one I never caught. A flicker of movement caught my eye. A uniformed officer, his face a mask of grim determination, emerged from the cave's maw. He paused, squinting against the gathering dusk, then gestured for me to approach. I moved, each step a deliberate act of will, my boots crunching on the damp, gritty sand. The air grew thick with the metallic tang of seawater and something else, something acrid and unsettling. Coal. The officer's voice was rough, laced with a weariness I knew all too well. He recognized me, of course, the disgraced detective. What have I got? He ran a hand over his bristly chin. It's clean, almost too clean. They got in, took what they wanted, and vanished like phantoms. He gestured with his chin towards the cave. The entry point, it's not something I'd expect, down here where the water's already starting to creep in. I stepped past him into the damp, echoing space. The smell intensified. This was his territory. I knelt, my gloved fingers brushing against it, not just dust, tiny fragments like powdered obsidian. I'd seen this before, in the sterile, controlled environment of the evidence room, meticulously catalogued. It was a byproduct of a specific cutting agent, one used for its ability to leave minimal trace. Anything. The officer asked from the entrance, his voice a low rumble. I didn't answer immediately. My mind was a battlefield, old wounds reopening, old strategies resurfacing. The precision of the breach, the calculated timing, the almost surgical extraction of valuables. It was all there. They knew exactly what they were doing, I said, my voice a low growl. They didn't force their way in, they persuaded the locks, and they didn't leave much behind. I pointed my torch at a section of the cave wall where faint, almost imperceptible scratches marred the rock face. See this? They used a diamond-tipped drill, small gauge, almost undetectable unless I knew what to look for. The officer moved closer, his own light playing over the markings. How can I be so sure? Because I've seen it before. The words hung heavy in the damp air. My past failure, a phantom limb, throbbed with renewed intensity. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was a message, a taunt. I stood, the water now swirling around my knees. The tide was rising faster than I'd anticipated. A visceral unease settled over me. He was back, or someone wearing his mask, and he was telling me he was here. What did they take? I asked, my gaze sweeping the cavern. Jewelry, high-end pieces, from that collector's estate up on the bluff. They bypassed the alarms, the security systems, like they weren't even there. The collector's estate, of course. He always had a flair for the dramatic, for targeting those who flaunted their wealth. It was about more than just the loot. It was about the spectacle. I turned back to the entrance, the officer watching me with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. This is him, I stated, my voice firm despite the tremor that ran through me. Or someone who studied him very, very closely. The officer's brow furrowed. Him, I mean. The one I couldn't catch, I finished, the words tasting like ash. The wind whipped around us, carrying the mournful cry of gulls. The sea continued its relentless advance, threatening to swallow the evidence, to erase the scene. But it couldn't erase the truth. The game, it seemed, was back on. And this time, I wouldn't let the tide wash away my chance for redemption. The salty spray kissed my face, a cold, unwelcome baptism. The rhythmic hiss and suck of the tide, a sound I'd heard 1,000 times on better days, now felt like a predator's breath, counting down my remaining seconds. The chalk outline, a ghost on the damp sand, was already blurring, the seas advance an impatient tide of erasure. But the details, oh, the details were harder to wash away. I knelt, my fingers tracing the faint indentations left by the victim's final struggle. A perfectly placed, almost surgical incision in the fabric of his jacket, just enough to expose the bone beneath. Too clean for a common thief, too deliberate for a random act of violence. This wasn't about greed, this was about precision. It was about a signature. A shiver, unrelated to the biting wind, snaked down my spine. The echo of a name, whispered on the edge of memory, tugged at my thoughts. A name I tried to bury deep beneath layers of regret and cheap whiskey. Years ago, they'd called him the sculptor, and I'd been the one who let him slip through my fingers. A gruff voice shattered the fragile quiet. "Cole, what in God's name are I doing here?" I didn't look up. The uniformed officer, his face a mask of professional curiosity and thinly veiled disapproval, stood a few yards away, his breath misting in the air. He was young, his uniform still crisp, his belief in the system presumably intact. I envied him that. Just observing, I managed, my voice rough. The sand gritted between my teeth. He took a hesitant step closer, his eyes scanning the scene with a practiced gaze. The preliminary report says it was a robbery gone wrong. The victim had a valuable watch. I finally turned, meeting his gaze. His eyes were a pale blue, earnest and unclouded. A watch? Is that what they're telling I? I gestured to the shallow cut on the victim's jacket. Does that look like a struggle over a timepiece to I? This is art, officer, twisted, brutal art. He frowned, a flicker of doubt crossing his features. Detective Miller said. Detective Miller, I interrupted, the name a sour note, is looking at the obvious, the ones this killer leaves behind. I stood, brushing the sand from my worn trousers. The dampness seeped through the fabric, a constant reminder of the encroaching water. I ran not officially on the case, Cole, the officer said, his tone shifting, a subtle warning in his posture. Retired. Retired doesn't mean blind, I countered, my gaze sweeping the cave's damp, slick walls. The air was thick with the smell of brine and something else. Something metallic, almost coppery, that the sea hadn't managed to dilute. I knelt again, closer to the waterline, where the waves were now lapping at the victim's discarded shoes. My fingers brushed against something small and hard, lodged between two barnacle-encrusted rocks. I carefully extracted it, smooth, almost unnaturally so. I turned it over in my palm, not something I'd find lying around on a desolate stretch of coast. "What's that?" the officer asked, his curiosity piqued despite himself. "A clue," I said, my voice low. I pocketed the shard, the cool weight a tangible presence against my thigh, or maybe just a pretty piece of rock, but I knew. I felt it in the marrow of my bones. This wasn't just a pretty rock, it was a breadcrumb, a taunt. The tide was rising faster now, the water swirling around our ankles. The officer glanced nervously at the churning sea. "We should probably head back before we get cut off." I nodded, my gaze still fixed on the receding chalk outline. "Yeah, I should go." I waited until he was a distant figure, his silhouette shrinking against the gray sky before turning back to the cave. The water was already surging, obscuring the last traces of the scene, but I had seen enough. The sculptor was back. The game, it seemed, was far from over. It had merely found a new, unforgiving arena, and I, against all good sense, was back in the ring. The cold air no longer felt like spray, it felt like a challenge. The salt spray kissed my face, a constant, damp caress that did little to wash away the grit under my fingernails. The coastal cave, tide coming in, had swallowed the last whisper of the night's grim performance, the water's relentless surge erasing even the phantom scent of ozone. It was a fitting end, I supposed, a grand finale for a ghost, but the ghost, as always, had left its mark. I stood on the slick, barnacle-encrusted rocks, the wind whipping my coat around me like a tattered flag. The early dawn light was a bruised purple, bleeding into the bruised gray of the sea. My breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhale a small, visible testament to my continued existence, a fact I sometimes found myself questioning. The third heist, bigger, bolder, and more brazen than the others. This time, It wasn't a quiet snatch and grab from a forgotten warehouse or a discreet pilfering from a private collection. This was a statement, a meticulously orchestrated disruption that had the city's underbelly buzzing with a nervous energy I knew all too well. A call had come in hours ago, a hushed voice on a burner phone, the kind of communication that usually meant trouble had found me. It was the colleague, the one who still held a grudging respect for the detective I used to be. His words were clipped, urgent. "Cole, I need to see this. It's happening again." And so I found myself here, the damp chill seeping into my bones, the echo of the ocean's roar, a constant reminder of the tide that waits for no one. The pattern was undeniable, the precision. It was him, or someone wearing his skin. I'd spent the night piecing together the fragments, the scraps of information that had trickled in. The target, a secure vault at the city's main shipping terminal. Not just any vault, but one holding a significant shipment of raw, untainted diamonds, destined for international markets. The method, a complex bypass of the laser grids, a silent disabling of the pressure plates, and a surgical extraction that left no trace of forced entry. The timing, during the shift change, a window of opportunity that spoke of insider knowledge or, more disturbingly, an almost supernatural foresight. My own demons stirred, a restless swarm of buzzing insects in the back of my mind. The last time I'd seen this level of calculated artistry, it had ended with a body count and a permanent stain on my career. The serial killer, known only as the sculptor for his macabre displays, had vanished into the ether, leaving me with the wreckage of my reputation and the gnawing certainty that I had failed. Now, the sculptor's phantom was back, leaving his signature on a new canvas of crime. But this was different. The sculptor had been about the art of the kill, the psychological dismantling of his victims. This new architect of chaos was after something tangible, something valuable, or was he? Perhaps the diamonds were merely a distraction, a glittering lure to draw attention away from a deeper, more sinister purpose. The colleague's battered sedan materialized on the winding coastal road, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom like hesitant beams of hope. He stepped out, his face etched with a weariness that mirrored my own, his uniform a stark contrast to the rugged landscape. "Cole," he said, his voice rough. "They're calling it the Diamond Ghost now. This is the third one this month, each one cleaner than the last." He tossed a folded piece of paper onto the hood of my car. "The terminal's security footage is useless. They were ghosts, but there's this." I unfolded the paper. It was a photograph, grainy and distorted, taken from a distance. It showed a figure, cloaked and indistinct, standing on the roof of the shipping terminal, silhouetted against the city lights. The pose was deliberate, almost theatrical, and then I saw it. A subtle tilt of the head, a specific angle of the shoulders. It was a pose I'd seen before in the crime scene photos that haunted my nightmares. "He's taunting me," I murmured, the words swallowed by the wind. The colleague's brow furrowed. "Who's taunting I, Cole? I know something about this." I met his gaze, the weight of years of unspoken truths pressing down on me. "This isn't just about diamonds, is it?" He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "The precinct is in an uproar. They're bringing in the federal agents. They're talking about a task force. And they're talking about I, Cole. They remember my obsession with the sculptor case. They're wondering if I were involved." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and unwelcome. Involved. As if I would orchestrate such a spectacle, but I understood their suspicion. "I'm not involved," I said, my voice low and steady. "But I know who is, or I know what he's capable of." I looked out at the vast expanse of the churning sea, the endless horizon. The stakes had risen, not just for the city, but for me. This wasn't just about catching a criminal anymore. It was about confronting the ghost of my own failure, about proving that the sculptor's legacy didn't have to be written anew. "They're looking for a thief," I said, turning back to the colleague. "I'm looking for an artist." The tide was coming in, and it was bringing something far more dangerous than water. It was bringing the past crashing back onto the shore. The salt spray, a constant kiss on my face, did little to wash away the acrid taste of suspicion. The detective's words echoed in the cavernous space of my mind, each syllable a hammer blow against my resolve. Involved. The accusation felt like a phantom limb, a phantom guilt I'd carried for years. Now it seemed it had found a new host. I traced the damp, rough texture of the cave wall with my fingertips, the chill seeping through my skin. The rhythmic sigh of the waves outside, a relentless tide inching closer, mirrored the pressure building within me. This place, the coastal cave, tide coming in, was where they'd found the last of the stolen artifacts. A peculiar choice for a rendezvous, or perhaps a disposal site. The air here was thick with the scent of brine and something else. Something metallic, like old blood. My gaze swept over the scene, cataloging details the uniformed officers had deemed insignificant. A discarded length of rope, frayed and worn, coiled near a cluster of barnacle-encrusted rocks. A faint scuff mark on the damp sand, too faint for most, but to my trained eye it spoke of a hurried departure. And then my breath hitched. Tucked beneath a jagged overhang, almost swallowed by shadow, was a small, tarnished silver locket. It was intricately engraved, a swirling pattern of vines and leaves, a design I recognized with a jolt that sent a tremor through my entire body. This wasn't just a heist anymore. This was a message. I picked up the locket, its coolness a stark contrast to the heat rising in my chest. The clasp was stiff, resisting my efforts. I worked it gently, my fingers nimble from years of such delicate tasks, and with a soft click it sprang open. Inside, two faded photographs. A man and a woman, their faces blurred by time and moisture, but their smiles undeniably present. The woman's hair was styled in a way that belonged to a different era, a time before the city's concrete arteries choked the life out of its history. The detective had been insistent. Just random targets, coal. High value, low security. Nothing to suggest a connection. But they were wrong. They always missed the subtle threads, the invisible ties that bound these disparate acts of larceny into a single, terrifying tapestry. I remembered the early days of the serial killer investigation, the same meticulous planning, the same uncanny ability to vanish without a trace. The victims then weren't targeted for their wealth, but for something far more personal. Each one had a connection, a shared secret, a forgotten transgression. And the killer, the phantom I'd chased through the city's underbelly, had a penchant for leaving behind small, symbolic tokens. A single pressed flower, a child's forgotten toy. The locket in my hand felt heavier than it looked. The woman in the photograph, there was something about her eyes, a familiar sadness, a flicker of recognition that I couldn't quite grasp, like a half-remembered dream. I pulled out my battered notebook, its pages stained with countless interrogations and stakeouts. The list of stolen items from the recent heist scrolled before my eyes. A rare manuscript from a private library, a collection of antique coins from a secluded estate, a jeweled dagger from a museum's forgotten vault. Individually, they were valuable. Collectively, they were a puzzle. What did a centuries-old book have in common with a handful of tarnished coins and a dagger? My mind raced, sifting through fragments of memory, searching for the missing pieces. The targets were geographically diverse, their owners seemingly unconnected. Yet the precision, the almost surgical execution of each crime, was a signature I knew all too well. The tide was rising, its murmur growing louder, a constant reminder of time slipping away. I had to get out of this cave, out of this suffocating atmosphere of decay and deception. I slipped the locket into my pocket, its cool metal a comforting weight against my thigh. The detective was right about one thing: I was involved. Not in the way they thought, but in a far more profound and dangerous way. This wasn't just about catching a thief. This was about confronting a ghost, my ghost. The air was cooler now, carrying the promise of a coming dusk. The locket felt like a key, a tangible link to a past I tried to bury. But the past, I was learning, had a way of resurfacing, like debris churned up by a storm. And this storm was just beginning. The air in the coastal cave, tide coming in, was thick with the scent of brine and something else. Something metallic like old pennies. It clung to my tongue, a bitter reminder of the damp earth and the rot that festered beneath the surface of things. The detective, a hulking silhouette against the sliver of moonlight piercing the cave mouth, had left me with a gnawing unease. Involved. The word was a hook, snagging on the frayed edges of my memory, pulling me back to the shadows I'd sworn to leave behind. My flashlight beam cut a shaky swath through the gloom, illuminating slick, dark rock formations that dripped with the relentless advance of the sea. I'd come here, to this damp, forgotten place on a hunch. The informant, a weasel-faced man who traded secrets for freedom, had mentioned a name I hadn't heard in years. A name that belonged to the man who had made me a pariah. The beam landed on a discarded cigarette butt half-crushed, its filter stained a faint, telltale crimson. Not blood, I told myself, just cheap tobacco, but my gut clenched. It was the same brand the killer had favored. This wasn't just a hunch anymore. This was a convergence. I moved deeper, the sound of my boots crunching on shells and pebbles a jarring intrusion. The tide was a hungry beast, its tendrils of foam snaking further into the cave with each surge. Soon this whole place would be submerged, swallowed by the indifferent ocean, a fitting end for secrets. Then I saw him hunched in the furthest recess, silhouetted by the faint, phosphorescent glow of the water. He was smaller than I remembered, his shoulders stooped as if under an invisible weight. But the profile, the way his head was tilted, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hands. It was him. I rasped, my voice rough, unused. He flinched, a startled bird caught in a hunter's beam. Slowly he turned. They held a familiar, unnerving stillness, the kind that spoke of oceans of pain and the calm that followed a final, desperate surrender. I knew I'd find me. Why are I here? I demanded, my hand instinctively reaching for the phantom weight of a weapon that was no longer there. I'd learned to fight without it, but the instinct remained, a ghost of the man I used to be. He offered a weak, crooked smile, waiting, I suppose, for the tide to take me or for I. He gestured vaguely with a trembling hand towards the encroaching water. It's a fitting place, isn't it? A place of endings. These new heists, I pressed, ignoring the macabre pronouncements. They're my work, aren't they, just like before? He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. My work, I always did misunderstand my artistry, Cole. His gaze drifted to the cave walls, tracing the patterns of moisture. I merely inspired. The world provides the canvas, I simply add the strokes. Inspiration. My voice rose, frustration bubbling like the sea foam at my feet. People are getting hurt, lives are being torn apart. And I, Cole, he said, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting through the ambient noise of the waves. I am torn apart, aren't I, still, after all this time? I felt a flicker of the old anger, the raw, untamed rage that had once defined me. I'm not chasing ghosts, I lied, my jaw tight. I'm stopping killers. Are I? He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, a glint of something I couldn't quite decipher, amusement, pity. Or are I merely trying to prove that I am not the failure everyone believes I to be? The tide surged, a particularly large wave crashing against the cave entrance, sending a spray of cold water over us. The sound was deafening for a moment, a roaring crescendo that drowned out all other thoughts. When it receded, he was gone. I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the wet rocks. He was nowhere to be seen. The informant had said he'd be here, waiting. Had he lied, or had my confrontation spooked him? Then I saw it. Tucked into a crevice where the water hadn't yet reached, a small, tarnished silver locket. I picked it up, my fingers brushing against its cool surface. It was engraved with a single, delicate initial, E.E. Eleanor, the name I'd suppressed for so long, the name of the victim whose death had shattered my world and whose killer I had never caught. A wave of dizziness washed over me. This wasn't just a copycat, this was him. He was back, and he was taunting me. They were heading further in, towards the labyrinthine tunnels that branched off from the main chamber. The detective's words returned, sharper now, more pointed. Involved. Perhaps he wasn't talking about the heists. Perhaps he was talking about this, about my past, about my failure. The tide was rising faster now, the water lapping at my ankles. I had a choice to make: follow him into the unknown or retreat. But retreat felt like another failure, another ghost to haunt me. I took a breath, the salty air filling my lungs. I would not be defeated, not by him, not by my past. I stepped further into the cave, the cold water seeping into my boots, and plunged into the suffocating darkness, the locket clutched tight in my hand. The mystery had just deepened, and the cost of finding the truth was about to become far more personal. The roar of the sea was a physical blow, pushing me back, my lungs aching for air that wasn't thick with salt and desperation. When the spray finally cleared, the figure I'd cornered, the one who had spoken in that gravelly whisper about unfinished business, had vanished, gone. My beam, still trembling, swept across the damp, barnacle-encrusted walls of the coastal cave, tide coming in. Nothing but shadows and the relentless, gnawing sound of the ocean. He'd played me a final, mocking gesture before disappearing into the churning gray. My boots squelched on the slick, uneven floor as I scanned the back of the cave, a fissure barely wide enough for a man, now likely submerged. A dead end or a cleverly disguised exit. I cursed, the sound swallowed by the cave's immensity. He was gone, and with him the tangible thread I thought I'd grasped, but he'd left something. A scent, faint but persistent, clinging to the damp air like a stubborn ghost. Not just brine and decay, but something else. A metallic tang, sharp and acrid like old pennies, and beneath it the ghost of oil, the kind used to lubricate heavy machinery, not the kind I'd find on a fishing boat. I knelt, my gaze falling on a patch of sand near where he'd stood. A faint scuff mark, deeper than the others, as if something heavy had been dragged. I ran my fingers over it, feeling the grit. Then my flashlight caught a glint. A small, tarnished piece of metal, almost indistinguishable from a pebble at first glance. I picked it up, turning it over in my palm. It was a cufflink, or what was left of one. One side was intact, a dull, gunmetal gray etched with a tiny, almost invisible symbol. A stylized raven, its wings outstretched. The other side was mangled as if it had been forcefully ripped away, leaving behind a jagged edge. The raven. I'd seen that symbol before, hadn't I? Not in any official capacity, not on any evidence log. It was a flicker, a half-formed memory, like trying to recall a dream upon waking. I pocketed the broken cufflink, the metal cool against my skin. This was more than just a copycat. This was personal. Back on the deserted stretch of beach, the wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my eyes. The tide was creeping higher, erasing footprints, blurring the lines between the land and the sea, much like this case was blurring the lines of my own past. I drove back towards the city, the wrecked cufflink a heavy weight in my pocket. The heists. The meticulous planning. The dismemberment of the targets, not for their contents but for their very essence, their operational capacity. It wasn't about profit, not entirely. It was about dismantling something piece by piece. I remembered the file buried deep in the archives of my old precinct, a case I'd been forced to abandon, a case that had driven me to the brink. The architect. That's what the papers had called him. A phantom killer who left his victims scattered like discarded blueprints, each death a deliberate act of deconstruction. His signature had been the absence of something, a crucial component removed from the scene, leaving investigators to wonder what was missing, what was the point. He'd never been caught, and I, Cole, had been the one left holding the wreckage of that failure. Now the heists were mirroring his modus operandi, not just the precision but the why. The targets were always companies on the verge of a breakthrough, inventions that could change the world, or corporations that held significant sway over. What? Infrastructure. Information. The missing pieces. He wasn't just stealing. He was sabotaging. He was erasing potential. I pulled over, the city lights a hazy glow in the distance. I rummaged through my worn leather briefcase, past old case files and scribbled notes, until my fingers found the slim, unmarked manila envelope I'd kept hidden, a secret I'd guarded fiercely. Inside, a single, grainy photograph. A young man, barely out of his teens, standing awkwardly at a company picnic. He was the son of one of the architect's early victims. He'd gone missing shortly after his father's death, presumed another casualty. But there was something about his eyes, a quiet intensity, a simmering rage I'd recognized even then. A stylized raven, the metallic tang in the cave, the oil, the deliberate dismantling of the targets. It wasn't just about the architect's methods. It was about the architect himself, or someone who knew him, who admired him, who was finishing his work. But why now? And why these specific targets? My mind raced, piecing together fragments. The companies targeted: a tech firm developing advanced AI, a bioengineering lab working on revolutionary gene therapy, a company developing a new form of sustainable energy. All revolutionary, all potentially world-altering. And the architect, in his own twisted way, had been a destroyer of progress. The symbol, it wasn't a gang. It wasn't a cult. It was a personal emblem, and the sun in the photograph. He had the same intense gaze as the man I'd seen in the cave. The same quiet, simmering fury. The heists weren't just mirroring the architect's methods. They were a continuation, a twisted tribute, and the perpetrator wasn't just a copycat. They were an acolyte driven by a singular, all-consuming purpose. And the broken cufflink, the symbol, it was a message, a taunt. He knew I was back. He knew I was looking. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The tide was coming in, not just on the coast, but in my own life, threatening to drown me in the wreckage of the past. But this time I wouldn't let it. This time I would confront the ghost. I would find the acolyte. The puzzle pieces were starting to click, forming a picture far more terrifying than I had imagined. He wasn't just repeating the past, he was completing it. And I was standing in the path of his final, devastating act. The salt spray stung my eyes. A relentless, cold kiss from the churning ocean. The roar of the sea, a constant, guttural growl, filled the coastal cave, tide coming in, making the very air vibrate. When the furious spray finally cleared, the figure I'd cornered, the one who had spoken in that gravelly whisper about unfinished business, had vanished. Gone. Damn it, I breathed, the word ripped away by the wind. Unfinished business. That phrase, a phantom limb of my past, twitched with agonizing familiarity. My boots slipped on the wet rock as I scrambled out of the cave's maw, the receding tide leaving behind a glistening trail of seaweed and shattered shells. The night air was a welcome, albeit frigid, embrace. I squinted at the horizon, a bruised purple where the sea met the sky. Nothing but the relentless march of waves against the jagged coastline. He was good, too good. Or perhaps I was too slow. The thought was a familiar, unwelcome guest. Back at my borrowed flat, the smell of stale coffee and desperation clung to the air. I nursed a lukewarm mug, my gaze fixed on the corkboard that had become my sanctuary and my torment. Photos of the butcher's victims, newspaper clippings detailing the heists, and my own scrawled notes formed a chaotic tapestry of failure. Each pinprick of light on the board felt like a tiny accusation. The butcher. I'd come close, so close, but he'd slipped through my fingers like smoke. It was the retired forensics technician, the one with the uncanny knack for seeing what others missed. His voice, usually calm and measured, crackled with an unusual urgency. "Cole," he began, his tone clipped. "I've been going over the security footage from the last warehouse job, the one with the unusual entry point." I straightened, my weariness momentarily forgotten. And it's not just the method, Cole, the timing, it's too precise, too personal. Personal how? I pressed, my fingers tightening around the ceramic mug. The access codes, they weren't brute-forced, Cole. They were entered manually, an old one from my precinct years back before the system upgrade. My breath hitched, an old override. That meant someone with intimate knowledge of the precinct's inner workings, someone who had been there during my tenure. The butcher had operated alone, that was the prevailing theory. But this suggested an inside man, or perhaps a connection I had never considered. Who would have access to that kind of information? I asked, my voice a low growl. Not many, key personnel, and, well, anyone who might have been privy to my case files back then. I was pretty deep into it, Cole, dug up a lot of dirt. The implications settled over me like a shroud. The butcher wasn't just mimicking his old methods, he was taunting me, weaving a narrative that pulled me back into the labyrinth of my own past. Anything else? I asked, my mind racing, sifting through faces, through hushed conversations, through the debris of my former life. There's something else, Cole. At the scene, near the main vault, they found a small trinket, a child's toy, a faded wooden horse. A wooden horse. I knew that horse. It belonged to Lily, my daughter. She'd lost it in the park the day before the butcher's first victim was found. I'd spent hours searching, my heart a leaden weight in my chest, but it had never turned up. The phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering against the floor. The toy. My daughter's toy. How? Why? This wasn't about the heists anymore. This was about me. And he had just raised the stakes to an unbearable level. The salt spray kissed my face, a cold, unwelcome caress that did little to clear the fog in my mind. The tide was a restless beast, its rhythmic sigh a constant reminder of the encroaching darkness. I stood at the mouth of the coastal cave, tide coming in, the damp air thick with the scent of brine and decay. This was where the last message had been found, etched into the slick, barnacle-encrusted rock. The child's toy, a symbol of innocence lost. You see it now, don't you, Cole? Lily's wooden horse. A ghost from a life I'd tried to bury. The memory still pricked at me, sharp and unwelcome. The park, the frantic search, the gnawing emptiness in my gut. That day, the day before the butcher's first victim was discovered. A day that had fractured my world. And now, this echoed echo delivered to my doorstep, or rather to this desolate stretch of coastline. My hand tightened around the worn leather grip of my service revolver. This wasn't just about the heists anymore. This was about Lily. This was about making amends for a past I couldn't outrun. They knew about Lily, about the horse, about the guilt that clung to me like a shroud. They were playing a game, and I was their reluctant pawn. But I was no longer the man who had faltered. I was a man with nothing left to lose and a burning need for retribution. I'd spent the last 24 hours piecing together the fragments, the taunting breadcrumbs left behind. The precision of the heists, the uncanny similarity to the butcher's modus operandi, it was too deliberate to be a coincidence. This was a performance, a twisted homage. The cave, a gaping maw in the cliff face, beckoned. It was a natural trap, a place of both sanctuary and peril, perfect. I adjusted the small, discreet microphone clipped to my collar. He owed me, and I owed him the truth eventually. For now, his silence was a necessary commodity. My footsteps echoed in the damp confines of the cave, each crunch of shell and gravel amplified by the cavernous space. The smell of the sea was now mingled with something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, a scent that sent a shiver down my spine. Blood. The tide was higher now, its murmur a low growl at the cave's entrance. Soon this place would be submerged, a watery tomb. Then I saw it. Not a body, not yet, but a tableau. A child's rocking horse, crudely fashioned from driftwood, sat in the center of a small, sandy clearing. Beside it, a single, pristine white glove. My breath hitched. The butcher had always left a signature. A single white glove placed with unsettling neatness, a stark contrast to the brutality of his crimes. This perpetrator, this mimic, was not just referencing the past, they were recreating it, amplifying it. I circled the horse, my senses on high alert. Was this the trap, or was the trap still to be sprung? My mind raced, sifting through possibilities, discarding the improbable. They wanted me to feel the fear, the helplessness. They wanted me to relive the despair of that day in the park. I knelt beside the horse, my fingers brushing against its rough, splintered surface. I picked up the glove, its fabric surprisingly soft. The scent of lilies, faint but unmistakable, clung to it. Lily. A soft click echoed from the cave's depths, a sound almost swallowed by the roar of the incoming tide. My head snapped up, my hand instinctively going for my weapon. The trap was set, and I had walked right into it. The sound came again, closer this time. A shuffling, a dragging. My pulse quickened, not with fear, but with a grim, determined resolve. The hunt was on. The salt spray, thick and cloying, coated my tongue. Each breath was a battle, a desperate gulp of brine and decay. The roar of the ocean, a hungry beast gnawing at the rocky shore, was the only sound that mattered now. I'd followed the whispers, the breadcrumbs left by a phantom, to this place, the coastal cave, tide coming in. The air inside was heavy, pregnant with the smell of damp earth and something metallic, something that made the hairs on my arms prickle. My flashlight beam, a trembling finger, traced the slick, dark walls. Water dripped, each drop a mocking echo of the ticking clock in my head. He was here. The cave floor was a treacherous carpet of loose stones and seaweed, slick with the encroaching tide. Lily's wooden horse, a forgotten toy from a life I'd tried to bury, had been the first tremor. Now the ground beneath me felt ready to split. My boot scuffed against something yielding. I lowered the beam. A discarded length of rope, thick and knotted, lay coiled like a sleeping serpent, not just any rope. The same kind used to bind the butcher's victims. This wasn't just about preventing another crime. It was about closing a wound that had festered for years. I moved deeper, the beam of my light cutting through the gloom. And then I saw him. He stood by a makeshift table, his back to me. He was silhouetted against the dim glow, a figure of unsettling stillness. The air crackled with an unseen energy, a tension so thick I could almost taste it. He turned slowly. The face that greeted me was not the monster I'd imagined, not a hulking brute. It was a face etched with a peculiar kind of weariness, the eyes holding a depth that spoke of unspoken pain. Just a man. "Cole," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very stone around us. It wasn't a question. My hand instinctively went to the worn leather of my jacket, the phantom weight of a service weapon a ghost on my hip. Years of training, years of instinct, screamed at me to act, to move, to strike. But something held me rooted to the spot. The way he spoke my name, the lack of aggression in his posture, it was a disarming tableau. "I know who I am," I stated, my voice rough, unused to the damp air. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I've been watching, for a long time." He gestured to the table. Scattered across its surface were items that sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. A collection of antique lockpicks, meticulously cleaned, a small, leather-bound journal, and a single tarnished silver locket. The locket. It was identical to the one found on the butcher's last victim. "The heists," I prompted, my gaze flicking from the locket to his face. "They're my work." He didn't deny it. Instead, he picked up the locket, turning it over in his fingers. A signature, a statement, a way of ensuring I'm seen, heard. Heard by whom? The question hung in the damp air. The butcher, he's not real, is he? Not in the way they thought. A flicker of something sadness crossed his face. He was real enough to the people he hurt, real enough to ruin lives. He met my gaze, and for a moment the weight of years seemed to lift, revealing a raw vulnerability. He was a ghost I chased. A ghost I became. The truth of his words hit me like a physical blow. The butcher. I'd been on the case, young, ambitious, and utterly out of my depth. And now the echoes. It wasn't a copycat, it was the original. I was the butcher. The words felt inadequate, absurd. He finally offered a ghost of a smile devoid of humor. I was the architect, the performer, the one who disappeared when the curtain fell. He placed the locket back on the table. And Cole, I almost caught me. The tide was higher now, lapping at the edges of the cave. The sound of the ocean grew louder, a constant, insistent reminder of the world outside and the peril of this enclosed space. "Why now?" I demanded, my voice strained. "Why resurface?" "The echo," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "It started to fade, the fear, the power. I needed to remind them, and I needed a witness." He gestured with his chin towards the entrance, where the relentless waves were now churning, a churning more of white foam. "The tide won't wait, detective." My mind raced, piecing together the fragments, the inconsistencies I'd dismissed years ago, the lack of forensic evidence, the impossible precision, the way he'd always seemed one step ahead. It all coalesced, a horrifying, undeniable truth. And I was trapped with him in a coastal cave, tide coming in with the sea rising to claim us both. This was it. The end of the line, for him and perhaps for me. The tension in the air snapped, and I saw the glint of metal in his hand. The game had changed. It was no longer about discovery, it was about survival. The salt spray, sharp and cold, stung my face as I stumbled from the mouth of the coastal cave, tide coming in. The roar of the ocean, once a frantic symphony to my racing thoughts, now a dull, insistent pulse against my skull. My knuckles throbbed, a dull ache mirroring the deeper thrum of exhaustion in my bones. The phantom's reign was over. The carefully constructed edifice of his terror, so meticulously built over years, had crumbled into the shifting sand beneath my feet. The sea, ancient and indifferent, claiming its secrets. My secrets. The detective stood a few yards away, his silhouette stark against the bruised twilight sky. He hadn't moved since the final, echoing gunshot. I could feel his gaze, heavy and unreadable, but I didn't turn. Not yet. The weight of what had just transpired pressed down on me, a suffocating blanket woven from relief and a profound, unsettling quiet. He'd been so confident, the phantom, so utterly convinced of his own brilliance, his own untouchability. He'd underestimated the persistence of a man who had nothing left to lose but the ghosts that haunted him. He'd underestimated the sheer, stubborn refusal to let the past win. I remembered the first time I'd seen him, or rather his work. A string of impossibly clean robberies, each one a masterclass in misdirection. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no trace. Then came the escalation. I'd chased him for years, a relentless pursuit that had consumed my life, chewed it up, and spat me out onto the fringes of society. The phantom had taunted me, leaving breadcrumbs of his genius, always just out of reach. He'd known I was coming, had anticipated my every move. And I, the disgraced detective, had been his chosen opponent. He'd confessed it all in the end, his voice a dry rasp against the cave's damp rock. The meticulous planning, the elaborate schemes, the sheer thrill of outsmarting everyone. He'd even admitted to the small, almost insignificant details that had gnawed at me for years: the misplaced tool at one scene, the peculiar choice of getaway vehicle at another. I finally turned, the salt wind whipping my hair across my face. The phantom was gone, taken by the tide, by his own hubris. The evidence, scattered and damning, lay within the coastal cave, tide coming in, soon to be washed away just as he had intended. But the truth, the ugly, undeniable truth, had been laid bare. "It's over," I said, my voice rough, unused. The detective nodded, his expression unreadable. He understood. He knew the cost of this victory. I walked towards him, each step a deliberate effort. My body ached, a testament to the brutal dance we'd performed in the depths of that cave. The phantom had been a master of illusion, a weaver of intricate lies, but he had also been a man with vulnerabilities, with a desperate need to be understood, even if that understanding came at the end of a barrel. He was good, I admitted, the words tasting like ash. Too good for too long. The detective finally offered a ghost of a smile, but not good enough. Coal. He was right, he wasn't. The phantom's intricate web had finally snapped. The years of obsession, the sleepless nights, the gnawing doubt, it had all led me here, to this windswept shore, to this quiet resolution. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't the triumphant roar of victory, but the quiet hum of a battle finally won. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel quite so powerful. The phantom was gone, and in his absence, a space had opened. A space for me to finally breathe. The coastal cave, tide coming in, had given up its final secret, and in doing so had set me free.